Hill talks taxes. He has been for over 45 years, and there isn't a human on the planet with more experience solving problems on behalf of taxpayers. He wants to solve your problem whether you know you have one or not. So if you do have a tax problem, get a hold of him by calling his office, visiting his website, TaxHelpOnline.com. If you don't have a tax problem, your current tax problem is taxes themselves. So let's get into the policy issues of today. The main one being the bill being considered in the Senate, which is a Taxpayer Service and Assistance Act. What does that even mean?
Well, what it's all about, Joshua, are major changes to procedural and administrative elements within the IRS. It deals with the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. It deals with some taxpayers' rights issues. It deals with the Appeals Office. And this bill is pointed at specifically providing assistance and relief to individuals dealing with IRS enforcement issues, policy issues, and so on.
So that's it. They're finally giving taxpayers assistance rather than just grinding them into power.
There's a lot of elements of this bill that are very favorable, and they're actually going to help people if they're implemented properly. The question, of course, is what survives the legislative process, and that just remains to be seen.
So who got religion and decided that they should do something good for the good of the country instead of just taxing us more? Well, where did this bill come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually bipartisan. Democrat Senator Ron Wyden and the Republican chairman of the Senate Finance Committee introduced this bill. It actually hasn't technically been introduced yet. This is a bipartisan kind of a thing, and it's designed to number one, make the IRS a little bit more efficient in a couple of different ways and help people struggling with the IRS, particularly low-income folks. Yeah, low-income folks that have a tax collection problem.
Now, you said this wasn't yet introduced. Are we counting our chickens before they're hatching here, or what's going on?
Well, not exactly. I mean, it's not exactly wishful thinking. Here's the deal. The bill has not formally been introduced into Congress as yet. So it doesn't even have a bill number. And, they're still talking. But what they did do, Josh, is they circulated to the House Ways and Means Committee and they circulated to the Senate Finance Committee a draft of the bill, a discussion copy of the bill. And it's very detailed. It's 163 pages, very specific. And I have to believe once this does get into Congress, it's going to go pretty fast. Now, keep in mind the roadblock up to this point, starting in late January of this year, when Trump was sworn in as president, they started immediately to work on what came to be the Big Beautiful Bill Act, which was the reenactment of the Tax Cuts and Jobs. They did that, and it took all of the time of the Congress of the United States to work through that. I mean, there was hours and hours, days and weeks, in fact, months in the process of working out that legislation and getting something passed, which the president signed into law on July 4th. So now that bill is done and the Big Beautiful Bill Act has been enacted. I believe that this thing is going to have the same kind of fast track treatment that we'd like to see.
So you believe that it's going to be a priority, but what evidence is there that it's actually going to be a priority?
Actually, there is some evidence. It's a good question because a consortium of Democrats submitted a letter to the Senate Finance Committee just last week. In fact, it was earlier this week that they submitted the letter and said, insofar as this Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act is concerned, here are our thoughts. Here are some of the things that we want to see going on with this bill. So it's generating activity. It's generating interaction. It's generating response. And as I said, I think it's going to get kicked in the butt here in short order.
Even a broken clock is right twice a day. The Democrats have done something right by introducing a bill that is nicer to taxpayers, which is uncharacteristic, but we got to give them credit where it's due. My question is, since it's being suggested by Democrats, is it going to just be dead in the water because of the Republican opposition?
Well, no, I think it's really the other way around. It's really promoted by the Republican side of the aisle here. And remember, the Republicans control the House and the Senate, Josh. I think this thing is going to move through. I think there are things in this bill that would really legitimately be nonpartisan discussion. We can get into some of the specifics of the bill in just a minute. There are things in this bill that are very nonpartisan. Congress has been working on for years that haven't really gotten done. We can talk about what that looks like. In that sense, I really do think they're going to get motivated here to push this along.
So maybe some truly common sense governance going on here. But let's talk about some of the main provisions.
There's some common sense government in the context of a tax system that completely lacks common sense.
If you're going to have some kind of intrusive tax system, they need to at least figure out a way to make it as least intrusive as possible. But anyways, let's talk about some of the main provisions of the bill. What does this do about phone service? And is there anything that helps people deal with the delayed refunds and delayed processing?
Yeah, the bill addresses these things. The very first section of the bill talks about the IRS's callback system. All right. What they want to do with this phone system is they want to get this thing developed to something that's far more efficient than what they have now. Right now, Josh, you got upwards of 150 million people that are calling the Internal Revenue Service every year, and the vast majority of those calls occur during tax season. Naturally, people are calling up to get help with their tax returns and tax refunds. This bill would create a far more sophisticated callback system. When you call the IRS right now and you're on hold, a message comes on the line that says, if you would like to receive a callback from the Internal Revenue Service, leave your name and your phone number. And folks do that. Well, what happens, Josh, is when they call you back, they stick you back in the hold queue. So even though they've called you back when supposedly it's your turn to talk, you still might be on hold for an hour and a half to 2 hours. The problem is their hold system only lasts for 2 hours. If you're on hold for 2 hours, the system just cuts you off. If they're going to call you back when it's your turn, it should be your turn when they call you back. They're working on that to get that up to speed so that when they do call you back, it is your turn. And now you're talking to a live representative at the IRS, whoever it may be, that will help you. One of the reasons why people call the IRS is because of refunds. Where's my tax refund? Has my tax return been processed? And so what they're going to do is dedicate development time to put a link on the IRS's website where you can more easily check your tax refund. People had the capacity to set up accounts and get online access to certain information through the IRS's website. It requires an ID me setup. You got to send in your identification and answer security questions. And the IRS sends a hard mail letter with a username and a temporary password that you set up. Then you change all that. Now you've got secured access to your accounts through the IRS's website. We have the same system here as tax professionals. We can access your tax information. If we've got a legitimate power of attorney or disclosure authorization on file with the IRS, we can get access through the Tax Pros portal on their website. It's very fast and efficient. I can get transcripts, for example, that tell me every single thing that's going on with your case. Well, they're making moves in that direction to allow individuals to do that. And that's one of the things that this bill would do, specifically with respect to tax refunds and tax returns.
Sounds like there's a long overdue implementation of technology, and yet didn't we already acknowledge that there wasn't going to be any money put towards improving systems in the last appropriation?
Well, that's not exactly correct. What we talked about in our last podcast with the 2026 proposed appropriation to the Internal Revenue Service for their operations, we talked about a $2.5 billion budget cut, right? So they're going from roughly $12.5 billion down to roughly $10 billion. There's no designated appropriation for tax systems modernization in the sense of buying new computer hardware. They've spent upwards of $33 billion on computer hardware since the turn of the century, and they've got nothing to show for it. What we're talking about here is specifically allocating resources the IRS already has to developing the software systems they need to manage this. In this context, it's not the same as buying more hardware.
So it's just optimizing the resources they already have rather than insisting that they need newer and better resources. That makes sense. Are they also revamping the taxpayer advocate? Are they giving the taxpayer advocate more power, more say? What's going on with that?
The Office of the Taxpayer Advocate is a fundamental function that every American citizen needs to know about. Whether you got a problem with the IRS or not, you need to know about the taxpayer advocate. The Office of the Taxpayer Advocate functions as a liaison between the IRS and the taxpayer so that under circumstances where normal systems fail, where the IRS is carrying out an action that they shouldn't be carrying out, failing to carry out an action that they're supposed to carry out, the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate can step in and provide help to the taxpayer to get that problem resolved. Typically speaking, the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate steps in when there's some kind of hardship, and this is one of the rules required of the taxpayer advocate, is there's got to be a hardship involved on behalf of the taxpayer. In other words, the actions or lack of actions that the IRS is carrying out is causing a hardship for the taxpayer, and so that's when the taxpayer advocate will get involved. In the context of what we're talking about here, there's a couple of important things. First of all, the taxpayer advocate will have the authority to direct hire attorneys that work for the taxpayer advocate. Right now, the taxpayer advocate is not answerable to any of the enforcement functions of the Internal Revenue Service. They're not answerable to collection managers. They're not answerable to appeals managers. They're not answerable to audit managers. But the attorneys that work for the IRS work in the Office of Chief Counsel, defend the IRS in court. So you got a bit of a conflict of interest when the taxpayer advocate, whose written job description is to represent taxpayers, has to work with IRS counsel attorneys whose job is to defend the IRS. So So there's clearly a conflict there. This provision would allow the taxpayer advocate to direct hire attorneys that would work specifically for the taxpayer advocate, strictly helping taxpayers solve problems. That's very important. Now, there's another thing that I think is critical here that's going to happen with the taxpayer advocate.
Have you submitted your application to be the first attorney that works specifically for the taxpayer advocate? I know you could probably train every single new taxpayer advocate there's been in the last 20 years.
That would be my job application, Josh, is to train the attorneys that go to work for the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate. But no, I have not submitted my application to do that. As you know, I did submit information to the Trump administration to help with the IRS, but I heard crickets on that.
Noisy world out there with 360 million people. But usually that's why we do these podcasts, because nobody's going to hear you unless you keep making noise.
Well, that's true. So right now we got crickets, but let's go on to one of the critical elements of this bill insofar as the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate is concerned. And that is this: when you request help from the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate by submitting IRS Form 911, that is considered a tolling event. Now, that might not mean a lot to a lot of our viewers here, but let me explain what that means, and it's very critical. The Internal Revenue Code has a collection statute of limitations. A lot of people think, Josh, that the IRS can chase you for the rest of your life. If you owe money to the IRS, they can chase you to your grave and beyond the grave. And that is simply not true. There's a collection statute of limitations, just like every other statute of limitations in law. Once the IRS assesses a tax against you, records it as a debt in their accounting system that Mr. and Mrs. Smith owe X dollars, that liability becomes they have 10 years to collect the tax. If they can't collect the tax within that 10-year window, it just goes away. There are certain actions that a taxpayer can take that has the effect of extending that statute of limitations. For example, if you file a bankruptcy, that extends the collection statute. If you file an offer in compromise, that extends the collection statute. If you file a request for collection due process hearing or a request for innocent spouse relief, there's a series of actions that a taxpayer can take that stop the clock from running. It extends the statute. We call that a tolling event. It stops the clock. It tolls it, keeps it from running. One of those events is the submission of a Form 911, which is called an application for a taxpayer assistance order. One of the ways you get the attention of the Taxpayers Advocate's Office to solicit help from the taxpayer advocate is to file that Form 911. And in fact, if you go on the IRS's website and you say, how can I get the taxpayer advocate to help me? They tell you, file a Form 911. When you file the Form 911, that's a tolling event. It stops the clock from running. So in that sense, it's a very important or sharp double-edged sword. On the one hand, you get to solicit the taxpayer advocate for help. On the other hand, that stops the clock from running and gives the IRS more time to collect based on how long that statute is tolled. So one of the things this bill would do, Josh, is to repeal that tolling event. It would change the law so that the request for relief from the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate is not a tolling event. And I think this is a very important benefit for taxpayers.
This certainly sounds like a win. What else? The IRS has been trying to license tax preparers. Does the bill deal with that at all?
The IRS has been fighting for 10 years or more to try to get tax preparers licensed. Here's the irony of our tax system. I mean, this is the greatest irony in all of modern American politics and law, as far as I'm concerned. The Internal Revenue Code is probably the most complicated body of law in the federal system. I can't imagine there's anything in the United States system of jurisprudence more complicated than the Internal Revenue Code. We got a tax code that consists of more than 4 million words that was changed more than 6,000 times since 2000 alone. And in fact, I would argue it's probably more than 7,000 by now with everything that's happened in the last 5 years. This is a very complicated system. It's convoluted, changed regularly. Even some of the brightest legal minds in the country can't agree on what these various provisions stand for and how they interact, the cross-references and all this insanity with the Internal Revenue Code. And yet, no training is required as a matter of law to be a tax preparer. Anybody can roll out of bed tomorrow morning and hang a shingle that says tax returns prepared and go into the tax preparation business. You might want to take a class, or you might focus on this kind of a tax return and not on those tax returns over there. But the fact of the matter is there's no regulation, Josh. Even though this law is so complicated and convoluted and subject to change and amendment and court decisions that interpret this, there's no required training, no licensing, no basic oversight by the IRS of tax return, unlicensed tax return preparers. And, unlicensed tax return preparers cause, not all of them certainly, but a lot of them cause a lot of problems for taxpayers because they don't know what they're doing. The IRS passed regulations years ago requiring tax return preparers to be licensed and to subject themselves to continuing education. Those regulations were struck down by the courts because the IRS didn't have legislative authority to create the regulation. And so this has been going on in Congress now. They've been trying to get some licensing through, and there's specific provisions in this bill that will license preparers and require them to have certain hours of continuing education, require paid preparers to sign the tax return, have very stiff penalties for so-called ghost preparers. Ghost preparer is a person who prepares the tax return or contributes significantly to the preparation of the tax return but doesn't sign it. All right, they're called ghost preparers, and so the IRS would have stiff penalties for those preparers. And the key thing here, of course, would be a requirement of some kind of education program and continuing education program for these people to what they're doing. This is very important.
So it sounds like you, as a tax professional, think that tax professionals need to be licensed. But as a
I think they
taxpayer,
know what they're doing.
well, of course, they need to know. Let me
Go
the question. There's three layers to the question here. As a tax professional, it sounds like you agree that the IRS or that tax preparers need to be taxpayer. Let me finish.
Let me answer the licensing part. The license doesn't mean competence. There's plenty of people that are licensed to drive a car that have no idea what they're doing. The simple fact that somebody's licensed to drive an automobile doesn't mean that they don't get in the car drunk and drive around and kill people. The license itself does not mean competency. A license is really a device for control. It gives the government the authority to pull a person's license and therefore prevent them from working in a particular.
Okay, this is why we're getting off track. There's three layers to the question. Is it important, on the other hand, to have the ability to do it yourself and have no repercussions of being licensed? And also, would that have any effect on just average Joe Schmo being able to do their own tax return?
All right, to answer your question, the best case scenario is radical simplification of the Internal Revenue Code so that the average person does not have to seek a highly trained professional in order to comply with the law. I believe it is a fundamental violation of a person's due process rights that a tax law is so complicated that they can't understand it and so voluminous that they can't read it. All right, under the fundamental principles of due process of law, we as citizens have the right to know what the law requires of us. We have the right to be able to comply with that law simply, quickly, and inexpensively. Right now, that is not the case with the Internal Revenue Code. Over 80% of taxpayers rely on some kind of paid professional, whether it's software they purchase or they hire a CPA or lawyer to help them with compliance. More than 80% of taxpayers are seeking some kind of professional advice. That is a violation of the essential elements of due process. We should not have to go out and seek the advice and counsel of a highly trained professional in order to comply with the law. The law should be simple, it should be concise, easy to follow, easy to understand. All right, that is a constitutional requirement in my opinion. So the best case scenario, to your point, what helps taxpayers more than having licensed professionals, what helps taxpayers far more than that is a simple system that they can easily understand and comply with.
Yeah, very simply agree with that. So
let's get back to your licensing thing, because
yes.
I think this is an important point. The license doesn't portend competency. We both know that, but the requirement for certain educational thresholds at least gets us on the path in the right direction.
Right.
If an individual is required to take, let's just say, a 12-hour course or a 15-hour course on tax preparation that's provided by some accredited educational organization. My organization, for example, the Taxpayers Defense Institute, is accredited to provide continuing education to attorneys, accountants, and enrolled agents in the area of IRS abuse prevention and cure and taxpayer representation. We produce professional seminars and webinars every single year, dozens of hours of continuing education, and we're accredited to do that.
Including
right?
the one coming up in October.
We have our Taxpayers Defense Conference in October in Bloomington. Go to my website, TaxHelpOnline.com, click on the Tax Professionals tab, and you'll get more information about that. People have to be competent to provide this advice, and competency comes through proper education.
I definitely agree with that. So not to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like as a tax professional, you believe that continuing education is required. Gatekeeping the industry behind a license that requires continuing education is probably for the best.
I think is is going to help people overall. Yes.
How about confusing notices? What are we dealing with?
Let's talk
It's more like a confusing question.
Let's just put it this way. The IRS mails out millions of notices.
The IRS mails out millions of notices a year, and about 96% of them are confusing. What's going on with that?
Well, it's more like 100% are confusing and misleading, and about 50% of them are just wrong. One of the most common notices that the IRS mails out is called a correction notice. That's provided for under a particular provision of the Internal Revenue Code that allows the IRS to look at a tax return, and they look at every single return that's filed every year, goes through an electronic screening process, and they look for a number of things. Math errors is one of them, mechanical errors in the return. You put a number on this schedule that's supposed to be carried over to that schedule, and it's not carried over properly. All those are mechanical issues. Maybe there's a claim on the return that exceeds a statutory limit. For example, the deduction for state and local income taxes is capped at $10,000. So if somebody files a tax return that claims $12,000 as a deduction, then this correction notice would recalculate the tax liability based on making that adjustment. There's about 25 or 30 different specific examples in the statute that allows the IRS to make these corrections. And the law says they're supposed to be communicated to taxpayers. Well, the answer is they aren't communicated to taxpayers, right? So people get these correction notices. They have no idea what the IRS did or why the IRS did it or where they came up with their numbers or why it is that the IRS has charged these additional penalties on what appears to be an honest mistake. In other words, it's just simply not clear. And so people can't figure out whether the notice is correct or not. And as I said a minute ago, these notices are wrong about half the time. These correction notices are wrong about half the time. So what this law would require is fundamental changes to the structure of the correction notice. They have to specifically tell you what the mistake was and what particular area of the law allows them to recalculate your tax. In other words, where in the law does it provide for how this transaction needs to be treated and how you did it wrong? So people can read the notice and say, yeah, I guess I did mess that up, or no, I didn't mess that up. In other words, there's no confusion. What it's going to do is allow people to understand whether the IRS made a mistake or not. That's the key thing here. And so they've got to very clearly identify the mistake. They got to very clearly show the math on the notice as to how the recalculation was made. You used to owe X. We made this correction. Here's the correction. Here's the law that supports the correction. Now you owe Y. We've got this math laid out in front of you so you can clearly see what it is. And importantly, Josh, this is critical. When the IRS makes an adjustment per one of those correction notices, you have a right to challenge that. You've got the right to demand an abatement of that tax assessment. And if you request the abatement, the IRS has no discretion as to whether abate or not abate. They must cancel the tax liability as though it never existed. If they think you owe the money, they have to mail another letter to you called a notice of deficiency, which does clearly explain the correction. And that gives you an opportunity to appeal that notice of deficiency to the United States Tax Court before you have to part with any of your money. All right. So now the notice under this law require the IRS to explain what the appeals rights are with regard to the correction notices. A very important change.
Yeah, it definitely sounds important. It sounds at least fair to taxpayers. I will say these notices and changes sound a lot like what people go through on social media. Terms of service policy violations. When you violate one of these terms of service, they just give you the list of all the terms and services. And they say, I don't know, it was one of those to read through and figure out what you did wrong. And it's absurd. Yeah. They should be able to just tell you what you did wrong. There's an entire meme trend on the internet of people joking that the IRS, they know what you owe. They could tell you what you owe. They make you guess, and if you get it wrong, you go to prison.
It's not that simple for self-employed persons. If the IRS had real-time access to wage and income information, which they do for a lot of people, then maybe that's true, but it certainly is not true for any business, and it's not true for any self-employed person. So you got that problem for sure.
All right. Does this proposed bill do anything about communicating with citizens facing hardships?
Yeah, it does. This is another important part of the bill. Now, if somebody owes money to the IRS, they don't have the capacity to pay because of hardship. Hardship is defined by the Internal Revenue Code as the inability to pay necessary living expenses, all right? So you're either unemployed or underemployed, or your necessary living expenses are such that there's no money left over at the end of the month after you pay your current taxes for the current year, and you just can't pay the back tax liability. That's defined as a hardship. All right. When you're in that situation, there's a number of relief options that are available, but none of them are described to taxpayers necessarily. You basically find out the hard way what your relief options are. If there's a taxpayer out there who is defined as a hardship situation, and the IRS knows this because of interaction with that person, they now have the requirement to communicate what are called collection alternatives. A collection alternative is something other than full payment. Maybe it's penalty relief, maybe it's an installment agreement, maybe it's an offer in compromise where you go in and say, we owe you $500,000, but there's no way we can pay that money, but I can pay 5 or 10 or 20,000. That's an offer in compromise. Or maybe you're in a situation where your case needs to be closed as currently not collectible. What that means, you're either unemployed or underemployed and don't have the capacity to make a payment. The IRS can close that case as uncollectible and put you into a situation where they are off your back and out of your life for the time being, all right, while the collection statute ticks away. The IRS doesn't communicate these things to people clearly and in a manner where it's meaningful information. This notice requirement would require that when citizens are in that hardship situation, the IRS must communicate to them as to what their options are.
All in all, a rare win for taxpayers, a rare ethical decision on behalf of Democrat lawmakers. Let's just hope that it gets through. Basically, if you're watching this, call your congressman and say, hey, we want this.
The Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act, call your congressman and your 2 United States senators and implore them to get behind the passage of the Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act. We need to pressure Congress to get this through. I believe it's going to go through in substantively the form that it's in right now. Obviously, there'll be some tweaks to it. There always are, but we want to speed this along. So in the face of your United States representatives, your congressmen and your senators, and push them to do it.
Did you talk to anyone else about this topic recently? I know that you've been on a few other shows, including...
I've been covering this in my newsletter, Joshua, but I have not done any interviews on this yet.
What did you talk to Joe about the other day?
We talked to Ray about economic issues specifically. Ray's concern was the fact that most middle-class Americans, well, here was a statistic that started the conversation. It was a number he ran across that showed that in the 1950s and 60s, citizens 30 years of age or older, more than 50% were homeowners and married. Today, the number is less than 15%. So citizens 30 years of age, less than 15% own homes and have families. Joe asked me the question, what's going on with the middle class and why is that the case? We started talking about economics, the tax burden, and concepts of Marxist economics, transferring wealth from the producers to the government to the point where younger citizens don't have much of a chance of home ownership because homes have become so unaffordable.
There's a combination of increased taxes, increased inflation, and increased cost of living that has all combined into a perfect storm behind this also decrease in inventory, and especially in home ownership, because big money is out there buying up all the inventory and using that as real estate assets.
There's no question about that. One of the things, particularly with respect to housing, is the fiat money that's been pumped into the system in the last 5 years.
Well, that's inflation.
There's been roughly $9 trillion in fiat money that's been pumped into the economy. When you got an increase in purchasing power with no relative increase in productivity, that's what drives prices up, right? And people colloquially refer to that, the rising prices, as inflation, but rising prices is a result of inflation. The inflation occurs when they pump this purchasing power into the economy. Now you've got all these extra dollars chasing the same assets that are out there, or in some cases a reduced inventory of assets. That drives the price of those remaining assets up sky high. And so we talked about that quite at length.
Well, if you want to hear the rest of that interview, go check him out. Go check out, I guess that was the Susre show, right?
Yeah, it's called Garage Logic. Go to garagelogic.com and click on the show notes for August 7th.
So he was on August 7th, so you can check that out. Where else can they follow along with your Taxpayers' Rights Crusade?
Follow me at Pillow Talks Taxes. I'm primarily on TikTok, Facebook, Truth Social, and right here on YouTube. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share these videos, especially with your federal and state representatives, especially this particular episode where we talk about the Taxpayer Assistance and Service Act, which we need to get passed. And if you have a tax problem, go to my website. Go to TaxHelpOnline.com. Buy any book off my website at any price point, and you get a free 15-minute consultation directly and personally with me.